2 weeks into NHL training camp, here is everything you need to know so far about the Edmonton Oilers.
You are Locked On Oilers, your daily podcast on the Edmonton Oilers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Friday edition of Locked On Oilers. I am your host, Nick Zararis. I want to thank everyone who's making Locked On Oilers their first listen of the day. Locked On Oilers, a part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel, where if you place a $5 bet, you'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. So today's show, we're going to do a bit of a whip around. We're going to cover some of the key storylines so far, going through the training camp and the preseason, some position battles, who's in competition with who, what the early results say based on preseason games, practices, who's practicing with whom. So we're going to start with the most obvious and the biggest storyline so far through a few preseason games. The scores of the preseason games do not matter. I want to reiterate this. If you missed the episode the other day where we talked about what the value of preseason hockey is, for my everydayers, you know this, but preseason results do not matter at all. At all. I understand the Oilers have lost 18-5 aggregate over the course of these preseason games, but the individual game results do not matter. You have to apply context. You would not expect a team of seventh graders to do particularly well against a varsity football team. You know, if you sent a bunch of 13-year-olds to go and play a bunch of 17 and 18-year-olds, the 17 and 18-year-olds are going to obliterate those children on the football field. And it's the case here. The Oilers, in playing with a very, very split squad where you have an NHL heavy group and then you have a non-NHL group, you are naturally going to be up against teams that might have the inverse, where some teams are running a bit more of an NHL heavy lineup who want to get closer to their final roster sooner so they can work things out. They can get real long looks at certain players. Whereas you have the Oilers who, for the most part, know what their roster is going to be on opening night. And we talked about that a few weeks ago where we gave our best projection of what it's going to look like on opening night. And there have been a few elements we're going to discuss on today's show that have been added to the mix. But for the most part, when you are as solidified in terms of your personnel as the Oilers are, there's not a whole lot to glean from these games. There's not a lot to learn. So that's the advantage of splitting up your talent the way the Oilers have, where you have one group that's NHL heavy, and then you have the group that played the Jets the other night that had two NHL defensemen in front of Stuart Skinner. You want to get these guys minutes, but in playing them in that type of game, in playing Brett Kulak and Ty Emberson in the game where they're the only two NHLers, that's going to give them more ice time. And ultimately, that's kind of what matters. That's what ultimately matters, is the opportunity. There's nothing to be gained from having Connor McDavid play 21 minutes in a preseason game. Sure, could he use the skating just to get a little more game rep? Of course. Anyone can always use a little bit more conditioning. There's no such thing as too much conditioning. But when we think about this logically, we think about what we know about what we know about the human body and workload, rest, fatigue, etc. There is a real tipping point where you are just unnecessarily inviting risk into the calculation. And ultimately, we don't want risk. We want solidified answers. And when we talk about these preseason games, the scores do not matter. Please don't take a game where the Oilers play 7 NHLers against a Jets team that's almost all NHLers seriously. The Oilers are using their lineup this way for a reason. They are playing the bottom half of their lineup on a split squad, so those guys get more minutes. So Connor Brown gets more minutes. So Emberson, so Brett Kulak, so Stuart Skinner. So they are in the mix. Workload is what matters for those guys. And we talked about it on Wednesday, but ramping up is a process. To get physically ready for an NHL season is a multi-month process. There are guys who take that first month, for, in the case of the Oilers, most of July probably, not a lot of physical activity, light exercise, just casual. But part of that ramping up process for the grind of a long season is getting your body ready on a I don't want to call it a regiment, but a gradual escalation plan. You know how you stretch before you exercise, that type of deal, but on a macro level where you are casually ramping up your cardio, you are casually ramping up your strength training, and in the case of professional athletes, it's a bit more mobility based as opposed to just lift weight heavy a lot of times like the rest of us when we go to the gym. But you are ramping yourself up so that when you get here for preseason testing, you have a good baseline for the team to scale, to grade you on, not grade you on, evaluate you on. If you come into camp and you do well in the preseason testing, that gives you a baseline to operate out of. And then the team can start to ramp you up. They build a plan out for you based on where you start the season. And it's one of the things that I talk about a lot, and it's something I believe wholeheartedly in. It's an example where a team with resources can have a serious advantage. When you have the money to burn and it is in non-salary cap spending areas like support staff, like strength training, like nutrition, when you have an owner willing to spend money and you can really put all of the bells and whistles into your off-ice operation, you can really have an edge on some of these teams that are less inclined to spend money in those areas. So in talking about these preseason games, let me click over to my notes here. Like I said, the Oilers played with only 2 NHL defensemen and Stuart Skinner on that back end, a handful of NHL forwards. But for the most part, these games are about ramping up your body. And I want to point one thing out. The physical component of hockey is more important in these games than anything. Are these guys engaged? Are they skating well? Do they look in shape? Are they bent over, holding hands on knees, trying to catch their breath? Do they look slow? All of those little components tell you a lot more than the final score in a preseason game. Because for some guys on some teams, this might be the one real look they get at pushing for a roster spot until next training camp. There are guys in training camps right now, and some of them on the Oilers, who know if I don't make this team right now, the only way I'm getting back up here is as an injury replacement. And if I am in a waiver situation where I need to clear to go back down, I might not get that opportunity to come up, and the team might opt for somebody else because they would rather have me in the AHL, send somebody up that they can send back down. And that's one of the topics of conversation we're going to come up with in a few minutes when we transition segments and we talk a bit about that fourth line center role that may or may not be up for grabs depending on what you believe so far. But using the preseason as a ramp, as an on-ramp for the season is essential. And I will leave you with this parting thought for the first segment. So far, through the 10 months that Kris Knoblauch has been Oilers head coach, he has pushed almost all of the right buttons, almost every single time. The decision-making has been pretty sound. It has been rooted in logic, and he firmly has a grasp on what the team needs from him as far as leadership, as far as decision-making. When you have a coach who has demonstrated a pattern of making good decisions over time, even if the results aren't great, which they aren't so far, and we all know that 18-5 on aggregate is not good, you are inclined to give him the benefit of the doubt based on his previous track record. Look, if they go into the season and they get off to a really slow start again because the preseason bleeds over into the regular season, then we can have a conversation about it. But until we get to the regular season and those results start trickling in, you are not going to be able to make a fair judgment. So take a deep breath. I understand it's frustrating, especially if you're going to any of these preseason games to go and see your team lose in person. Deep breaths. It's going to be okay. Preseason hockey is more for the players than it is for anyone else, and it is for the players to get physically ready as opposed to working on their games. You're not learning a lot of stuff in a game. For the most part, most development, that happens off the ice. That happens in practice. That happens in meeting rooms where you are getting feedback on the way you've played and getting points of emphasis to change what you're doing if something's not working. So we are going to take our first break of today's episode of Locked On Oilers, where we've got your team covered every day. And when we come back, we're going to talk about some of the ongoing positional battles. So be sure to stick around. We are all driven by the search for better. But when it comes to hiring, the best way to search for a candidate isn't to search at all. Don't search, match with Indeed. If you need to hire, you need Indeed. Indeed is your matching and hiring platform with over 350 million global monthly visitors, according to Indeed data, and a matching engine that helps you find quality candidates fast. Ditch the busy work. Use Indeed for scheduling, screening, and messaging so you can connect with candidates faster. And Indeed doesn't just help you hire faster. 93% of employers agree. Indeed delivers the highest quality matches compared to other job sites, according to a recent Indeed survey. The thing I like about Indeed is that it is constantly getting better. Indeed leverages over 140 million qualifications and preferences every single day. So the more you use Indeed, the better it gets. Join more than 3.5 million businesses worldwide that use Indeed to hire great talent. And listeners of this show will get a $75 sponsored job credit to get your jobs more visibility at Indeed.com/lockedon. Just go to Indeed.com/lockedon right now and support our show by saying you heard about Indeed on this podcast. Indeed.com/lockedon. Terms and conditions apply. Need to hire? You need Indeed. Today's show is also brought to you by our friends over at Gametime. If you're trying to get to events, if you're like me, you're constantly going to concerts, baseball, football, basketball, hockey. We got hockey on the horizon. If you want to go and get yourself to an Oilers game, go check out Gametime with some of the best features in the ticket buying experience. My personal favorite, the panoramic view in the app. If you're going to a hockey game, you want to get an idea of the angle on goal you're going to have. Click on a ticket, get a panoramic view from your seat in the app before you buy. The lowest price guarantee or Gametime will credit you 110% of the difference. And Gametime ticket coverage, where your purchase is covered with the most flexible customer service policy in the ticketing industry. So if you want to take the guesswork out of buying tickets, go check out Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off. Download Gametime today. What time is it? Gametime. Thank you to everyone who is hanging out on this Friday edition of Locked On Oilers, where we are tackling all things preseason and training camp. We talked about it in the first segment. We talked about it earlier in the week. The everydayers know. We talked earlier in the week that when your roster is as solidified as the Oilers is, where there's maybe 2 or 3 roster spots for 9 guys that are competing for them, you are going to root out a lot of the fat other teams are going to have in their training camp roster. You know, if you're a team that doesn't have high expectations, that has a lot of candidates they'd like to get long looks at, if you're a Montreal, if you're a Columbus, if you're a Chicago, if you're a San Jose, in Anaheim, if you have consistently been drafting high, more than the 7 picks in a given draft, and you are constantly trying to find new guys and audition new guys and give them real serious looks against NHL talent because you want to see how far along they are in their process, you have a lot more to gain from the preseason. If you're a team like the Oilers, whose best prospect right now is probably Matthew Savoie, who probably can't push for a roster spot this year without an injury, that is both a good thing because it means you're relatively stable at the NHL level. But the counterpoint to that is that the preseason training camp, they're kind of a formality. And we all know the Oilers' big decisions in training camp are going to all be on the back end. We need to see what permutation of Stetcher, Travis Dermott, and Ty Emberson end up shaking out and making the opening night roster. From what we've seen so far, it does seem like it's going to be Emberson and probably Joshua Brown to start, because from the early looks, both in preseason games and in training camp practices, they've had Dermott and Stetcher skating together as a 4th defensive pair, which is a telltale sign that those guys are probably reserves and not people who are likely to make the team as starters. And I think the only real path, and I said this for Mike Hoffman, who almost certainly will get released from his PTO and relatively soon, the path for Dermott was as a 7th defenseman, and if he would be willing to sign a 2-way contract. We said that right after he signed the PTO on the full episode we did about Travis Dermott. If he was willing to sign a 2-way contract and be able to go to the AHL and then come back up and be sent back down without having to clear waivers, that's the path to Travis Dermott making the Edmonton Oilers. I don't think there's a way for him to make the NHL roster on a 1-way, because I don't think the Oilers want to expose Troy Stetcher to waivers. They probably don't want to. They can't expose. They probably could clear Josh Brown if they put him on waivers and to send him down. He would probably clear because that contract, 3 years, $1 million. It's not really cost prohibitive, but it's kind of expensive and term for a guy who's not particularly worth having under contract for 3 seasons. I understand. I personally would like to have seen. I would personally like to see Travis Dermott make the team because I think he's just frankly a better hockey player than Joshua Brown. But the other considerations, the other real positional battles developing, we do need to find out who's going to be on the second penalty kill unit with Adam Henrique. We are assuming that based on how last season ended in the playoffs and what the pairs have looked like so far, Connor Brown and Matthias Janmark are going to get first crack at trying to recapture their playoff magic. They put together all those shorthanded goals, those rush opportunities in the final and in the Western Conference final. But that second one, the one that's going to be with Adam Henrique, the early leader in the clubhouse seems to be Vasily Podkolzkin, which is very interesting because coming into the season, Podkolzkin had all of 8 career minutes as a penalty killer in Vancouver. So the fact that the Oilers identified his skill set, said, okay, based on how he plays at evens, we think he might be able to give us something on the penalty kill. And to expand on that, the main gripe I have with a lot of teams in the NHL today with their penalty kill is that it's just guys. It's guys who block shots. It's guys who check. You can do more than that if you're a penalty killer. You can play good hockey players on the penalty kill. I'm not saying you need to play McDavid or Draisaitl on the penalty kill, but you can have more than just fourth line plugs out there at 4-on-5. You can give guys out there who are going to take a little bit. And I understand the reason teams don't do that is because they want to mitigate risk. They would rather have guys who are going to be out there to play it safe, who are going to dump the puck the 200 feet, who are going to block shots, who are going to be as conservative as possible, because they look at the penalty kill as such a severe disadvantage that they don't want to take on any additional risk. I, for one, want to see the Oilers using the penalty kill as a momentum swing, as a fulcrum, the way they did in the playoffs. And look, the Oilers penalty kill is not going to be 95% in the regular season. We all know that. You had some changes, you lose Desharnais, I get it. It's still going to be pretty good. I still like to think that it's going to have the opportunities. We talked about Connor Brown and Matthias Janmark, but I think if you get Henrique, you get Podkolzkin, that's 2 forward tandems that are pretty good. You also have the Ryan Nugent-Hopkins card, which you can play if need be, if someone gets hurt or if it's the penalty kill is struggling. Nuge is an above-average defensive forward and somebody who plays a strong two-way game, who can also help facilitate shorthanded chance creation. And the penalty kill does not need to be just a hold-on for dear life situation. It can be an aggressive, let's prosecute this game. Let's attack this game and let's use our speed. Let's use our offensive instincts to be able to create shorthanded chances, because you can catch guys, especially in today's NHL, where most teams, if not all, are running a 4-and-1 forward, power play alignment with one defenseman. You catch that defenseman in between on his weight, where he's leaning either forward or back when they're receiving a pass, and you get your stick in the lane. You've got a path. And 5-10 years ago, that play really wasn't there because most teams were still running a 2 defenseman power play 5-10 years ago. But looking where we are now, the Oilers have an opportunity here. And this is one of the benefits of having a deep forward group. You can play more than just bare bones players on your penalty kill. Vasily Podkolzkin, I think, is at least an above average NHL roster player. That alone for a penalty kill is not something a lot of teams can say. There are a lot of teams at the NHL level who have just replacement level or below replacement level players on those fourth line spots whose assignment is simply please, 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 please don't make any mistakes. And that's it. That's their only role. Don't make mistakes. Block some shots. Check some guys below the goal line. That is their only responsibility. If you can get a little bit more out of Podkolzkin, you get a little bit more out of Ryan Nugent-Hopkins if he should penalty kill, for instance, or Adam Henrique, who has good offensive instincts. You can make the penalty kill an offensive element. I'm not saying they're going to score a ton of shorthanded goals, but don't just think of the penalty kill as an opportunity to survive for 2 minutes. You can play hockey during those 2 minutes. We are going to take our second and final break of today's show, and we come back. We are going to tackle some more of these positional and specialty unit conversations. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. where you can start the season with a big return on NFL football at America's #1 sportsbook. So when you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. You'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. It's FanDuel.com. If you're like me and you're a true sicko who's all in on the NFL being back, we do have some interesting games this weekend. The Broncos, Nathaniel Hackett revenge game coming to New Jersey to play the New York Jets and Aaron Rodgers. The Jets, 7.5-point home favorites. Minnesota going to Green Bay and what is supposed to be the return of Jordan Love, who looks like he's going to be a full go. The Packers, 3-point favorites. My personal favorite game of the weekend, though, the Philadelphia Eagles and Jalen Hurts going down to Tampa Bay to take on Baker Mayfield and the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. The Buccaneers, 1.5-point home underdogs. And if Justin Herbert plays, you cannot sleep on Chiefs Chargers. Debatable whether or not he will play. And then Sunday Night Football, Josh Allen, the presumptive MVP frontrunner through 3 weeks, going to Baltimore to take on Lamar Jackson, the two-time NFL MVP. The Ravens are 2.5-point favorites. If you want to get a little more action on a football Sunday, go check out FanDuel Sports. Thank you to everyone who is hanging out on this Friday afternoon on this episode of Locked On Oilers, where we are diving into all things preseason hockey in Edmonton, where the malaise of preseason is real. And look, I know it's only been a week and a half. I know they've played a handful of preseason games. I know I'm not the only one who just wants to get to real hockey. I know I'm not the only one who wants to get to meaningful hockey already. And look, this is a privilege. The Oilers are solidified. They don't have a lot of roster battles. We're talking about second penalty kill forward. We're talking about fourth line center. And we're talking about second power play. We are not talking about the real nuts and bolts of the team. Some of the other position battles, there are 3 candidates for that fourth line center role. You've got Derek Ryan, you've got James Hamblin, who got NHL looks last year for 30 some odd games, and you got Lane Peterson. Noah Phillip is in the mix, kind of, but he probably needs a bit of AHL seasoning before he's a serious candidate to be a regular NHLer after sitting out an entire season. The real argument here is James Hamblin doesn't need waivers if he were to make the NHL roster and then eventually be sent down. Lane Peterson does, and I don't think the Oilers want to not have Derek Ryan on the roster. And I think about it in terms of this. I think when you are an NHL team that is very close, as the Oilers are, that has a lot of talent, that got really close to winning the whole thing, you don't want to change anything. And I'm not here to say the difference between Derek Ryan and James Hamblin is the difference between winning and losing the Stanley Cup. But I do know NHL teams value experience, especially in that type of role. Everything we just talked about in regards to the penalty kill of responsible, safe, little risk as possible, those types of players are valuable, and NHL coaches really appreciate and value experience. It is maybe my single biggest complaint about the philosophy of modern roster construction is that NHL teams would rather play a older player who is bad than a young player who might be bad. And I'm not saying Derek Ryan's bad. He's a replacement level NHL fourth line center. He's no bells and whistles, nothing fancy, but his age, his experience, I know the Oilers are going to value that. And I think that's ultimately why. And I'm not the first person to say this, but it would take something truly remarkable training camp wise from James Hamblin or Noah Phillip or Lane Peterson to make the roster over Derek Ryan, because that's really the only spot for them. If they don't make the team, if they were to make the team, that's the spot they would be filling. And Peterson being able to clear waivers, not needing to go on waivers to be sent back down, that's an argument for him to make the roster over somebody like James Hamblin, who does have more NHL experience. And when guys need to clear waivers, that is what puts you in a pickle from a roster management perspective, because you might not necessarily be able to make the most linear or straightforward roster decision because you need to keep waivers in mind. And I want to be sure I said it right, just in case I misstepped over my words. James Hamblin does not need to go through waivers to go back down. Lane Peterson does need waivers if he were to make the NHL roster and then be sent down to the AHL. I just want to be sure I said that right. I might have tripped over my words, but I wasn't positive. Based on that, You probably have James Hamblin as the 13th forward or fourth line center were he to outplay Derek Ryan. Lane Peterson needing to clear waivers almost, I don't want to say instantly disqualifies him, but it makes it a lot harder for him because the roster gymnastics become a lot trickier. And I don't think Lane Peterson would get claimed on waivers, but it's an unnecessary risk you wouldn't want to take from an organizational perspective. The AHL does matter. Even if you are this good, like the Rangers, like the Oilers are, your AHL affiliate matters. You need to have pros down there that are going to be able to contribute to trying to be successful. And I'm not saying the Condors need to win the Calder Cup. I am saying they do need functional NHL talent down there so that the young guys the Oilers are working on, they have a real opportunity to improve, to get better, and be in a serious hockey environment. It does seem like Matthew Savoie will almost certainly be in the AHL this upcoming season. He needs teammates. He needs to be getting real reps with real players who have some NHL experience so that when the time comes for him to eventually get an Edmonton call-up, he's ready. There is no guarantee that any of these guys will make it. All you can do, and this will be the last thought for today's episode, all you can do from a roster construction, organizational management, coaching perspective, put guys in a position they are comfortable and put them in a position where they can succeed. If you ask a fish to climb a tree, you are going to be disappointed. I'm not saying you need to put Matthew Savoie on the Oilers' second line so he can be in the NHL right now. I am saying that you need to be putting him in a position in the AHL where he's going to play power play 1, he's going to play top 6 minutes, and he's going to get better. That's the goal for guys in the AHL. It is to get better so that when you get your NHL opportunity, you don't look out of your depth. Of course, the NHL game is faster, it's more precise, it's got more skill in it. But if you can get comfortable at the AHL level, it's just like school. You do well in 11th grade, they send you to 12th grade. You do well in 12th grade, you go to college. You do well in college, they keep promoting you up the course load of your major. It is a nonlinear process, which does confuse people. Sometimes guys take a year and 2 years, and not everybody has the same path. And it's part of what makes sports beautiful. But that will just about do it for today's edition of Locked On Oilers. So before we get out of here, if you could be so kind, please subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcast. Please give the show a 5-star review on Apple or Spotify. If you are watching over on YouTube, please subscribe. Hit the like button on the video. Hit the alarm bell so you get a notification whenever new content goes live. Leave me a comment. What are you learning about the Oilers so far through preseason? I will talk to you guys on Monday. Everyone have a fun and safe weekend. Till then, let's go Oilers.